Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Today I'm speaking with Monica Osborne. Monica is a trauma expert and she's the author of The Mithraistic Impulse. You can also find her writings at the LA Review of Books, The New Republic, JD Forward, and Newsweek. She used to be a professor of literature and film and trauma, and she's also editing something called the Speech Project. Hi Monica, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So I reached out to you. I watched your episode on Hold My Drink,
Right.
and I've been following you a little bit on Twitter, and I reached out to you because of you know the most recent spate of anti-Semitic attacks, and because I know you speak out a little bit about that. So if you want to talk a bit about that, I mean, I guess that kind of works in with some of the trauma stuff, because especially if you're being what I'm hearing about from students and stuff like that, that's even worse. I should say worse, but they're being ostracized at school and things like that. So if you want to talk about some of the attacks and how that fits in with what you were talking about with trauma.
Sure. It's interesting to begin from a place of trauma when we talk about how to frame these kinds of conflicts. And I'm not just talking about what's happening on the ground and in the air in Israel, Palestine, but about what from that conflict has been imported, not just to the US, but to a number of countries, right? We saw what happened in London this past week. There were, pro-Hamas protesters driving through the streets with Palestinian flags, shouting obscenities about Jews and, saying, let's, rape Jewish daughters, all sorts of really, really horrible kinds of things. So this is happening. It's happening in Europe. It's happening in the US. But it is very much about trauma for both sides at the very beginning, I think. But, what has happened is that you referred to the woke movement earlier, the woke movement or, the progressive or far left movement has essentially hijacked, what's going on in Israel. And, they're using it to support their own agenda. And so I think because, an organization like Black Lives Matter, for instance, they have such a big platform that when they post on Instagram something along the lines of "we condemn Israel and settler colonialism and white supremacy," that positions not just Jews in Israel, not just Israeli Jews, but American Jews and Jews all over the world, really, regardless of their skin color or their other ethnic or national heritages. It positions them as white supremacist oppressors. And who do we hate more than anything right now? We hate white oppressors, right? So, it's interesting because while I think, so many facets of this conflict did begin in a place of trauma, it's kind of been co-opted by something else.
Just a couple of things on that. First, one quick thing. I've been speaking to a couple of psychologists and psychotherapists about this, and I mean, I don't know what you want to call it, woke, social justice, progressive, that whole collective thing there. They've co-opted terms like trauma, and they've co-opted terms like PTSD. Okay, I was a civilian. I never liked this. I always want to make that clear. I was not military. I was not a soldier, but I worked in war zones for a long time. I was in Afghanistan for close to 7 years. Now, I had some weird things because of all the being aware of landmines and all the awareness training you get for landmines and IEDs and stuff like that. I was uncomfortable for the first 6 months. I wouldn't walk on grass. I wouldn't walk on anything that wasn't hard, like a hard pack, like asphalt, cement, for about 6 months. And the whole first year, it made me uncomfortable. So I'm not saying I had PTSD. I'm not trying to equate that with any anything long lasting thing or anything like that. But so I find that's been co-opted. But another thing you'd mentioned, we're importing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict here, but we're also exporting that. Oh, the white colonial settler. Um, I see it also in like North Africa and even other parts of the Middle East where secularism is a Western idea. Don't take it. It's colonialism. It's colonization. Um, there's a thing in South Africa going back about 4 or 5 years now. Science must fall, and they need a black science, not European science. So we're exporting that as well, and it's I understand the colonial thing. I mean, I was born in India. My family's from there. I mean, originally my family's from Yemen, so I have an idea of like the colonial. But we're taking the worst parts of both of those things. We're taking the worst part of the Israeli-Palestinian struggle, and we're taking the worst part of colonial studies. I mean, I don't think the Edward Said Orientalism route is the way to go. I think there's an enlightened approach you can take to post-colonial living or thinking. Anyways, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's also a problem with the terms that are thrown around with regard to Israel. And these are terms that, the Black Lives Matter organization and other progressive institutions and activists are using all over social media right now. Ethnic cleansing is one. There is no ethnic cleansing in Israel and Palestine right now. Do the Palestinian people have legitimate grievances against Israel? Absolutely. Is the blockade a problem? Absolutely. There are a number of things that Israel needs to fix and needs to deal with. But in terms of, ethnic cleansing, I think it was in 1948, there was something like 950,000 Palestinians. Now there's something like 5 million. That's not ethnic cleansing, right? So they're taking these terms, these big, bad, bombs of terms, and they're dropping them for impact when they're not completely accurate. But just to go back though to trauma for a second, and I think it's really interesting what you're saying about the kind of work you were doing and how it impacted you. And there is something traumatic, truly traumatic, about being exposed to those kinds of fears and threats day in and day out. So I understand that you don't want to necessarily, compare that to, other instances of trauma that are worse or greater or bigger, but there is an element of trauma there. So I grew up in the home of my father was a veteran of the Vietnam War. And he fought in the notorious Battle of Hamburger Hill, which was called that for a reason, because, they were literally crawling through dead and mangled bodies day in and day out. So he was wounded pretty severely, and he came home, and he never really left that war, right? It was always with him. And this was something that he talked about all the time with us, day in and day out. I'm the oldest of 5 kids, and it was something he talked about all the time. And, the PTSD was extremely severe. But there's, an interesting thing that happens with trauma, right? You're either somebody who talks about it incessantly, like my father, or you never talk about it at all. And these are, really the two responses to trauma. I remember, for example, one story he told me when I was about 13 about being in a helicopter with members of the South Vietnamese army and a woman from the village, a South Vietnamese woman from the village, who the South Vietnamese soldiers were accusing of having aided and abetted the North Vietnamese army, right? Which is a bad thing. My dad's telling me, a 13-year-old girl, this story, and he describes watching them put explosives into her body, light them, and push her out of the helicopter. So, I grew up with this idea of this body just falling through the sky over and over and over again, right? Stories that a 13-year-old girl should not hear, should not know. And that, there is an element of trauma to that. And there's, we can pass trauma down through the generations. And all of this is true. And all of this is legitimate. So much of what we know as the field of trauma studies comes from work that was done after the Holocaust. Psychologists working with Holocaust survivors over decades really formed what we know of as the field of trauma studies now. But it's maybe the term that's most overused now. For instance, I just actually wrote a piece about it I just sent it off the other night. A woman who's a parent at my son's school in Los Angeles. I'm in Vancouver now, but we're from Los Angeles. She had found out a few months ago that another parent at the school was a Republican and had voted for Trump. And she went into hysterics. And she claimed that she was traumatized, that it was real and legitimate trauma to find out that all of this time she had been in close proximity to, God forbid, a Republican, right? Because trauma now signifies, close proximity to someone who has a different viewpoint than you. So you can see this is just one of the many ways that trauma is being abused and misused and appropriated and hijacked and all of these things. And going back to Israel and Palestine, the trauma that's used, trying to think of the right word, by BLM, for instance, and other Black Lives, or other progressive institutions, this, the legitimate trauma that non-white people have experienced in the U.S. and in other countries in the world. Again, that's a legitimate thing, but they are taking that idea of trauma and they are breaking it into oppressor and oppressed, right? You're either an oppressor or you're somebody who's oppressed, and you can't be both. And it all has to do with trauma for them.
Look at the white thing, because even with the conservative thing, there's something, but like, I'll circle back to that later, but the white thing. Now, I was joking around with some friends last year, and, one of them's a professor of psychology. Another one, she's fairly active, constantly calling out like things like antisemitism. And she does a lot of good threads about the history of Jews, especially in North Africa and things like that. And, I was joking with them because last year there was a lot of it that came out, and I'd seen some of this stuff before where, when Jews talk about the Holocaust, they're centering it on whiteness because they were European Jews and they were white. And it was, that was, even though it was done by other white supremacists, they were part of the white system, blah, 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 blah. They're centering that all on whiteness because it's, something that happened to them. Look at how many people slavery killed and all this stuff. And then Anne Frank, she was just another white girl, and, white women's tears. And I mean, like, I was reading this, and this is okay, a fringe, but some of these people on that fringe have, a fairly decent follower count. I was joking with them. I said, you're going to see it. So this was last year around this time. I said, you're going to see it within 2 years. And I think I was being generous with the 2 years, that if it's people, if they're, Ashkenazi Jews, so basically, white passing Jews, stupid terms, but whatever. They are going to be said that they can't face anti-Semitism because they're white or white passing. And I mean, things like that are already starting to happen. And this idea of conferring whiteness, like, I've been saying this for a couple of years. I'm like, you're not only are you saying white people are evil, but you're giving certain traits and you're making being successful equating to being white. And, same time last year, I saw this thing saying yellow privilege, and then there was brown complicity in white supremacy and that kind of stuff. I'm like, and you guys are taking on whiteness. Like, my government, like our government in Canada, we're teaching our diplomats that being on time and being perfectionist and, individuality and objectivity is white supremacy culture. Like, what does that say to the brown people in this country? Like, so that demonization of white. And now then when, you equate Jews to being white, and unfortunately, the pigmentation of Ashkenazi Jews is, lacking melanin. But it's like you're breaking it down to such a small thing, and then you're making it the Palestinians or the very far right protesters, or the far right, whatever you want to call them, like, the pro-Hamas protesters in the UK, which I think are worse than in North America, but even the ones in North America, 2015, 2014, they weren't brave enough to be doing what they're doing now. But now they're seeing that, okay, Jews aren't getting any cover because, they're white. And that's coming from quote unquote progressive circles. That's coming. So like on that end of things, how does that set that, you're setting up people to say, okay, is that a signal for someone who wants to cause harm? Is that what is that? It's okay, we're having a fire sale here. Come on in. What does that say to someone like that?
Well, I think it is giving people license to go after Jews. I think it's open season on Jews right now. I think it's suddenly been made acceptable to demonstrate anti-Semitism. If you're on social media, you know that back in June, after the murder of George Floyd, everybody was posting their black squares on Instagram. There was a lot of even bullying, right? If you didn't post a black square, but any most reasonably decent people were horrified by what we saw with regard to George Floyd. It was like one of the few times where, I'm thinking Americans have come together. And, this was a moment where we could have all, been together. So, so much of this goes back to, again, if you're either a victim or an oppressor. And this is what CRT pushes. This is what critical race theory pushes. This is what's being pushed in progressive circles. And it's nothing new, right? I mean, this goes all the way back to the German Enlightenment. It goes all the way back to Hegel and the whole, every relationship, there's a master and there's a slave. And that's how we understand ourselves, right? We can only see ourselves as an oppressor or somebody who is oppressed. And so, what's happening is the problem is with the binary. The problem is with the dichotomy, right? And in many cases, Jews complicate that binary, right? Because are Jews white or are they something else? And of course, again, there are Ashkenazi Jews are light-skinned Jews. Ashkenazi Jews are white passing Jews, again, and I also hate all of that language because I hate seeing not anything, but I hate seeing everything through the lens of race, right? Because if we only see things through the lens of race, we're abandoning the class lens and, all of these other lenses that are really, really important. So, and this, you've probably heard the term multiracial whiteness. Have you heard that one? Yeah, that's got to be my favorite. If you're Black and you voted for Trump, you're white now because multiracial whiteness. And that's a really big problem.
Yeah. I call that the transracializing effect of problematic comments.
Right. Yeah. That's really good. That's really good, actually. So multiracial whiteness. So, Jews always problematize these kinds of binaries, right? Because are Jews white? Are they something else? And, as I said, there are all sorts of things. And Ashkenazi Jews, of course, have white or light skin. But the situation of, the majority of Jews in Israel are not white in that traditional sense, right? They're Mizrahi Jews, or they're Jews that have come from North Africa, or all of these Arab countries that have expelled Jews throughout the 20th century. Millions of Jews were expelled from countries in the Middle East by Islamic extremists or Arab imperialist regimes, right? And so, if those Jews are white, well, then so are the Arab countries the people in the Arab countries that expelled them, right? So there's this constant playing and tweaking of the terms to suit what really is a political agenda. And I think that's what's really, really problematic. And again, like I was saying, I'm getting the train of thought back. Like I was saying, Hegel was the first one to really, I don't know, popularize is the right word, but we'll just say popularize the idea of oppressor and oppressed. And every movement, every revolution has really picked that up historically since then. And of course, this is what critical theory is premised on, critical theory and critical race theory, this binary relationship. And I think that's part of the problem. Well, it's one of the biggest problems with how, those of us who are outside of Israel and Palestine, how we see and understand the conflict. We've been conditioned to see everything as an either or relationship, right? The good guys and the bad guys. There's no complexity, there's no nuance. And so we can only see what's happening in Israel and Palestine through that binary lens. And I think that's creating a lot of problems. Add to that the fact that nobody has time or inclination to do the research into some of these complex, historically complex situations, right? They would rather take a tweet or an infographic on Instagram and read it, believe it, feel as if they know what's going on, and then, post the heck out of it. So that's part of what's happening right now. And again, I'll probably say this over and over. I think a lot of the outward and blatant displays of anti-Semitism that we're seeing right now are a direct result of the CRT and the woke movement and some of these other progressive movements. I think they're directly connected.
Yeah, I mean, I study political science. Now I focus mainly on Central and Eastern Europe, but I also took a bunch of courses on terrorism and things like that. And if you read about what some of the regimes did, and just, it doesn't take much to dehumanize people. And it doesn't take much, like I said, equating whiteness with evil. And then you're starting this with young kids now. Like in Pol Pot's regime, it was, I forget what it was called, but it was an account of a reporter. And he was hiding out because he didn't want himself to be found out to be intelligentsia, right? And he didn't want to be killed. And, young kids who were maybe 10 or 11, after a couple of years, they were, like, he described a game now they were playing, and it was just killing other little children just randomly. And it was just because they could dehumanize them so much. And it's, so seeing that, like calling people white, like, first of all, like I said, equating basically successful with white, and, property is whiteness, capitalism is whiteness, everything's whiteness. Like, again, even last year in some of the riots after George Floyd, synagogues were damaged. And people like Hannah Nicole Jones said, well, that's just property, and property is whiteness, and that's just, people propping up whiteness when you're complaining about the synagogue being damaged. It's like, well, no, it was, and again, they had Free Palestine written on the synagogue, and it's like, what does Free Palestine have to do with the BLM movement? And this is not the trauma or whatever, but that's like the totalitarian side of that. None of us are free until all of us are free. It's like, I was speaking about this the other day, and I said, I think it's like the trans movement's small. BLM is not a huge movement. Like the protests got a lot of support, but now you see the support for the movement itself going down. But there's not a lot of people in BLM, like critical race theorists, gender theorists, queer theorists, all these people from the academy. They're not a large group. So they band together. Then you have, on the Palestinian side, you have people like Linda Sarsour, you have groups like CARE. I mean, we can get into, Omar and Talib and all that if you want, but but grassroots on the ground, CARE goes along with BLM quite a bit. So they kind of have to co-opt each other's stuff. So they're getting their strength in numbers. So it's just, so, you have BLM talking about the whiteness stuff because they had a lot of the melanin theory from Nation of Islam as well. Like BLM and Nation of Islam are tied together. So, it's they're sharing, they're using whatever theories each other has directed towards their enemy. If it's Linda Sarsour, yeah, it's Israel, so everything's got to do with Israel. So even BLM has something to do with Israel because it's police oppression here and it's police oppression there, right? It's like that dehumanization and that constant that's going out. Now, like, if you're, like I said, there was Jewish students recently putting out saying, okay, I can't, I'm losing friends, or I can't go to, I'll be told to stay off campus, this and that. Like, not even the physical attacks, but this kind of constant mental pressure, like where you're from all quarters, like what is that like, the kind of effect that will have on someone? Sorry, I rambled there to get to a question.
Oh. Well, what is the, what are you?
Well, I mean, like I've been seeing things where students are saying I'm not, they're not welcome in school, or they're, well, I'll give you another example. I saw on the British police in some town said there's going to be a pro-Palestinian protest. We cannot guarantee your safety if you're Jewish. Please stay inside your homes. Now, there are things from students where they're saying we were told that we can't, be on campus. We should stay at campus. That or not visible. Like, don't wear a kippah, don't wear a Star of David, don't wear it. So those kind of messages, like, how does that, like, you have the physical side of it, being attacked, but then those kind of messages, like, how are, you have to live like that. Like, how does that affect your psyche? Like,
well, it's stressful, to say the least. I mean, in Los Angeles and probably other places, some Jewish families have questioned whether they need to start taking the mezuzah off their door frame so that their house isn't, easily identified as a Jewish home. And, I have to admit, my husband and I did the same thing. We're, living in Vancouver, but we have a house back in LA, and my brother is staying there. And, he's, my youngest brother. And even though he's an adult, I think of him as the baby. And I just started thinking about, well, he's alone in that house. There's a mezuzah on the door. What if someone sees it? Should we have him take it down? These are the kinds of things that we're all experiencing right now. And, just yesterday, a synagogue that I've spent a lot of time in, and a kosher restaurant in Los Angeles that I've eaten at, I can't count how many times I've eaten at it, they both had bricks thrown through the windows yesterday. And then just last week, another kosher restaurant we eat at all the time out in the valley, that was vandalized. So it's really close to home for people right now. And, somebody like me, I've taught a lot of courses on the Holocaust and on anti-Semitism and stuff like that. I've been talking about it for years. You would think that I wouldn't be surprised. And yet there is a part of me that's, not just chilled by what's happening, but surprised, even though I've been predicting it. For the past couple of years, I've been saying, I think it's going to get unsafe for Jews. I really do. I really, really do. To the point that a couple of years ago, I even thought about, should I remove, any telltale sign of Jewishness from my social media presence? And then I realized that I would have to clean the whole internet of my presence. It's like I've exposed myself too much, with everything I've written and talked about and taught. But these are the things we're thinking right now. And this feels different. The anti-Semitism we're seeing right now feels different than anything we've experienced. And the way that they're spinning it, and the mental gymnastics that they're using to, some of the pro-Hamas and anti-Israel and really anti-Jewish activists it's I want to say it's fascinating, but it's horrifying, right? I mean, just this week we saw activists saying on Twitter and Instagram things like, stop condemning anti-Semitism. You're just playing into their hand. You're just giving them what they want, right? This nebulous they and them, it's, we've never seen that I'm aware of, people literally saying, stop condemning anti-Semitism because you're reinforcing white supremacy when you condemn anti-Semitism. It's crazy. It's crazy.
Did you see that?
People are.
Did you see the headline in the New York Times? The opinion piece?
Which one? Yesterday?
It was a couple of days ago. Basically the same thing. All these anti-Semitic attacks are helping out the Republicans. And it was like, huh? Where's that coming from?
That's it. Wait, anti-Semitic attacks
are helping the Republicans because you're publicizing the attacks, and it's like, because they're anti-Israel.
Oh, stop publicizing them.
Yeah,
they were saying.
Yeah, they're saying, because they weren't even saying so much stop publicizing them. It was almost a lament that these attacks are happening and it's helping the Republicans.
Right, but it's like, that's the wrong reason to be concerned about the attack.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, it's it's gotten really, really bad. And we fortunately saw a strong condemnation of it from the Biden administration, and I was very happy to see that. Because other people in the American political arena, people like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and AOC and others have not. I mean, I think Omar did say something, condemning anti-Semitism, but it's hard to take her seriously with everything else she has said that has been, so anti-Israel. And again, like I don't want to conflate Israel and diaspora Jews, right? Because some of the attacks right now are very much because of what's happening. They blame American Jews or European Jews for what's happening in Israel, which is really, really frightening, right? Because Jews in America are Americans; they're not Israelis. Yeah. Is there a connection to Israel? Sure, but for many, it's simply symbolic. We're citizens of other countries, so it's.
But that's playing on the old trope of Jews control the government. Jews control the media. Jews control the government. Jews, whatever magical Jewish powers. But the guy who shot up the Tree of Life synagogue said the same thing. It's Jews letting in all these immigrants, and it's Jews are controlling the government. It's if the government does anything pro-Israel, oh my God, it's supporting. So just that fact itself of either, it doesn't matter what. I mean, I think at this point it could be like we're going to donate money for, children's charity or something like completely benign like that will be politicized, whether you do or you don't. And it's
right.
But one other thing you mentioned now, a lot of the arguments I'm seeing now, whether it's against what is CRT and the people attacking CRT, or what you just mentioned about anti-Semitism, right? Oh, don't point out the anti-Semitism because it's going to help white supremacy. There was the exact same thing with ex-Muslims. It was the exact same thing. And now I'm not saying ex-Muslims are new or whatever, because these kind of criticisms, oh, you're helping the other side, like that goes back a long time. Like you can look at Black conservatives going back into the 60s and the 70s, how they were attacked. But a lot of the complaints, against, especially early on when it was only like people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and a couple others that were speaking out, no left-wing media would touch it. So she ended up going on Fox. It's like, oh my God, you're speaking to white supremacists, blah, 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 blah. And you're helping them out. And, there was a huge, within the community of ex-Muslims and the people speaking out against Islam, like Reform Muslims and ex-Muslim, there started being a rift of, oh, don't speak there because you're helping out white supremacists. And that became the argument. It's the same thing happening here. The argument isn't around whether or not, and this shouldn't really be an argument. Like, attacking Jews, is that good or bad? Like, okay, obviously, that shouldn't be an argument, but it's gone from there to how can we frame this so we don't empower white supremacists? But it's like, okay, white supremacists like when Jews get attacked, like what right. They'll participate. So maybe focus on the attacks, not worry about what white supremacists think. I see so many parallels within what was, and there's still lots of problems with, speaking out against Islam. You still get, you still get called, horrific things for pointing out that the hijab is misogynistic, and you still get, there's a huge fight between ex-Muslims and gay Muslims because ex-Muslims, they're no longer Muslim. And I mean, like, okay, but gays aren't exactly accepted in Islam either. So sorry, I don't want to derail this with that talk, but there's a lot of similarities. And I keep seeing this over and over and over again. And it's just dogmatic thought. Like, all these people think one way. I mean, they might have whatever they hate is something different, but they go about it the same way, and they think about it the same way. And you, like I said, I'd come back to the right wing thing, and it's the same thing here. After 9/11, they made criticism of Islam right wing, racist, Islamophobic, and I'm not saying that there wasn't part of that, but they made all of it. During the Obama years, they made patriotism right wing and racist. And again, you have things like the Tea Party. I'm not trying to absolve anyone on the right of any of the craziness that came from there. And then obviously with Trump. But you condition people for 20 years that right wing was evil. Now, if you don't like something, it's just right wing. So if it's support for Israel because Trump was more pro-Israel than any recent president, that's a right wing thing. That's a GOP thing. That's a Trump thing. It's easy to paint that evil, and like with this, I'm literally going to say they condition people to equate right wing with evil. Like it's and this is not I'm not trying to go into any trope of who controls the media or whatever, but it was done through media and it was done through academia, and it was acceptable conditioning going through, and now it's just so easy. I don't know how long you've been here in Canada, but that's all our prime minister does. If someone criticizes him, you're using right wing politics. That's Trumpian politics, and it's like that's not a defense of your policies, and that's where we're at now.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Absolutely. It's the discourse has become so polarizing and so divisive. I remember on social media it's really like over the past 4 years, once Trump got elected, so many people in my circles, I was living in Los Angeles. LA is a very Democrat left. I want to say liberal, but I feel like so much of what's going on is illiberal on the left. It's not really classic liberalism. But it was very, left, liberal, Democrat community. Everybody kind of thinks the same way. And of course, coming from academia, everybody's very far left. And, in some disciplines, especially, in humanities and English and literature and philosophy, if you're not on the far left, you don't want people to know. Right. So I would see people on social media saying things like, over the past years, if I find out that any of my Facebook friends voted for Trump, then, I will delete them, or you should just delete yourself now, because I don't want to be, I don't need anybody in my life like that. Trump was, he was Trump. So many awful things that he did and said, and, so many reasons to despise him. He's not a very kind person. But there were also times when the media would report that he said something or did something, and then I after a while I would go watch like the whole clip, and I would realize sometimes that it wasn't exactly, he didn't exactly say or do what they were saying he said or did. But I couldn't dare say that to anybody in my circle of friends for the most part, because then I could be painted as a Trump supporter. Likewise with the Abraham Accords that the Trump administration facilitated, that was a really incredible and historic and positive thing, but you weren't allowed to say that either, because it was something that the Trump administration did, and therefore it's evil. Everything he does is evil, right? Then again, I don't, on the right, the American right, we see that too, the way that they paint the left and even the Biden administration is it's all bad all the time. And I think the question is, how do we move on from something like that as a country? Because, I think it's, we're very divided right now. So then, you add something like Israel-Palestine to the mix. We just want to stay divided. You either, people on the right support Israel no matter what, completely and fully. And many people say, you can't criticize Israel because that's anti-Semitic, which I disagree with. I think, you can and should criticize Israel, just like you can and should criticize any country. Right. But then you've got people on the left saying, Israel, it's all bad all the time. It shouldn't even exist. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. We've got American politicians tweeting that out, saying that. And, what they're saying is from the river to the sea, there need to be no more Jews. We need to get rid of them. So this is really dangerous and violent rhetoric that's being pushed. And I'm starting to get riled up.
When you said, my friends don't want it, if there's a Trump supporter in here, and you heard Don Lemon say that if you go home for Thanksgiving and one of your families voted for Trump, like, disown them. Like, there's like that kind of rhetoric again. That's being in the academy. So, like, because you mentioned critical theory, now I'm going to take like Marcuse's idea of repressive tolerance. That came, like, I know he wrote the paper in like 64 or 65, but that came into the academy and the colleges of learning around the mid 80s. So let's say around 85, 86, that idea was coming in. And now you're going through the school system, regardless of if you're conservative or if you're, liberal, Democrat, Republican, it doesn't matter. Majority of people go through the public school system. That was being incorporated into the public school system. So you had the idea of, and so you're getting both kids, kids from all backgrounds getting that idea. Now, not everyone's going to pick it up 100%, but it's in the back of your mind. Now, just take, I don't want to say innocuous, but if you just take like Twitter's terms of service, or if you take Reddit's terms of service, things that'll get blocked are things that cause harm. They use they're specifically using harm in the same way Marcuse used it. And so when you have a generation of kids, right or left, growing up with this, and then they go into university and they're, taking some mandatory diversity training that's built, like, has this stuff as a foundation, or at least as a scaffolding to build on, right? Like, you're getting that reinforced over and over and over again. And so, yeah, you're going to come out and you're going to be polarized, and it's going to be, cut out your family, cut out your friends. I mean, the people who write about this stuff being a religion, I mean, I think they're spot on. It's one of the first things I noticed about it. But in Islam, it says, do not, only have friends with the Muslims. Like, it says, don't kill the people of the book. You can keep them as second, third class citizens. But it even says, like, do not take friends from among the Jews and the Christians. Like, only have Muslim friends. Like, if you're in a cult, like, cut off all dealings with the outside world, because you don't. But that's happening on both sides. By the time you get out of university, it's too late. Like, that's why I think some of the push that's going on, what's going on in K through 12 is really important right now, because it's, this is not just about turning your kids into leftist drones or whatever you want to say. This is about affecting all kids, and, the whatever the home life is, everything that's going to affect them. So if they get this idea that they have to cut out everything that's evil, everything that's harmful is evil, and they come home and, they get conflicting ideas of what's harmful, so they decide for themselves, and then now that's evil, and they've been given only one toolkit, and that's to root out that evil. I mean, it's like the education system. I mean, like, it's not just a simple problem of fixing K through 12. You've got the, colleges of learning, you've got the university, like, it's a whole system that needs to be fixed. But in my mind, that's the biggest problem right now. It's like, if you want less of this to happen, like, the people who are out there right now, you have to deal with them. But if you want to stop having, drones, like extremist drones coming out of K through 12 education, like, it's, it's like the educational system I'm seeing right now is it's a school to extremism pipeline. It's an extremism of any stripe. I'm not saying it's, you're going to be white supremacist. Like the nut bars, you're going to have a smorgasbord to feed off of. And like, that's my hugest concern about this. Like, when you're talking about like the narrative of coming out here, victimizing people and like polarizing people. But I mean, like, I wish more people would pay attention to the education stuff than these little stupid things. Like, are you helping right wing and left wing? Are you doing this and that? Are you using a Trump talking point? Like, you're not going to catch the orange plague. Like, just be honest with this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think what's going on in the K-12 school system is one of if not the biggest problem we have right now. And I don't know. I mean, we, again, we're in Canada, and my son's been in public school here this year, and I haven't really seen a lot of it, the CRT and all of that. But I don't know the extent to which it's as much of a problem in Canada. I know it's here, but I can speak to what's going on in LA, and the reason we are moving out of LA is precisely because of what's happening in the schools, because we feel that there's nowhere left in Los Angeles to send our son to school. Like it feels that bad to us. For instance, my son's school in LA, they recently announced that they're transitioning to a new curriculum from the Teaching Tolerance organization, which is recently rebranded as Learning for Justice. So, it sounds great, right? Teaching tolerance. Who doesn't want tolerance? It sounds wonderful. But, being who I am, the kind of person I am, I went to that website. I read every single link. I read every single document. I mean, it took me days to go through everything, but I looked at every single thing, and I was, sickened and horrified and devastated by what I saw. I mean, whether it's, they literally say math is political. We need to make math political. And what they essentially do is turn math into a social studies class with a few numbers sprinkled in. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy to me, and they literally say this teaching tolerance. They literally, in their newsletter, say that what educators should be doing is centering Black and brown students, move those students to the front of the classroom and to the center, move white students to the back and to the periphery. When students have questions in class, you call on all your Black and brown students first. And if there's time, you call on your white students. I mean, they literally spell this out, right? It's not like it's a hidden agenda. It's extremely blatant. And I just think, how is this going to bring people together? This is going to build and breed animosity among children, right? This isn't going to do anything to help race relations. And if you really do believe systemic racism is a thing, this kind of behavior and pedagogy is not going to do anything to solve it. But again, I don't think they really want to solve it, because there's no business in solving it. And, the DEI and the anti-racism businesses is $1 billion industry. So you need people to continue to think that they are perpetually and eternally victims, right? They have to always be oppressed, or there's no business, right? So this is still very much about money, and it's wreaking havoc and destruction in the schools. And it's like you say, it's a really big problem, and it's something that I am deeply concerned about.
I mean, okay, this nice out here, like in Canada, as far as CRT training, there are a few schools that are starting it, and more so after the George Floyd killing. Now, before that, and it's a little bit difficult here in Canada. Like I haven't gotten anything from anyway. Again, I'm not a big person to be getting these things, but a couple of parents have sent me a few things. It's the CRT style stuff is starting, but if you go back a few years, like even in middle schools around 2014, they had, especially on the feminist side of things, they were breaking it down to oppressor oppressed. So they were bringing that in. And we deal more with the post-colonial stuff, which is, coming out of which is an offshoot of postmodernism than more so than the critical theory. So it's, Canada always took it from a post-colonial viewpoint as opposed to a race viewpoint, whereas the United States, it was coming from, it was always the debate about slavery. And so that brought the race issue into it. And so the critical legal scholarships and all that started in the 70s, that started off from looking at the legal scholarship based on race. Whereas in Canada, because it was more homogeneously white, like French and British, than it was, Black people coming in here. Then you had what happened with the First Nations. So that's why it's a more of a post-colonial lens on that. So and I think it's less overt in the actual, if you go to the websites of some of the curriculums, it's just kind of a framework. It doesn't tell you what to teach. And teachers have a lot more liberty. Like just again, speaking with parents, so this is anecdotal. I cannot, I don't have numbers or anything on it. Um, a parent can have two kids in a school, and one English teacher will be following the curriculum more or less. The other one's like, okay, we're going to study, how to be an anti-racist. Like just, or between the world and me or something like that. Like it's
so it depends on who you get.
Yeah, and it depends on what is being taught to the individual students and what they're using. It's so I'm worried about it in Canada. I'm more worried about it in Canada in the encroachment in government. Like we have a Ministry of Diversity, Inclusion, and Youth. And the main focus of that ministry is to have an anti-racism secretariat, basically, and focusing on anti-Black racism, and it's straight Ibram Kendi anti-racism.
I was just going to say, he wants to create a DOA, a Department of Anti-Racism in the U.S. that isn't subject to any checks and balances, and that has to essentially okay any piece of legislation or any law that's passed has to go through this DOA. I mean, I find it chilling and, straight out of the totalitarianism manual.
Yeah, I mean, technically, Trudeau got elected last time with a minority government, and that was, just before COVID. Like it was late in 2019. So then COVID started becoming more of a thing in early 2020, right? So this didn't really get a chance to take off. But if you read their mandate, it's, they will look at all other ministries and government programs to make sure that they're following the anti-racism and also the gender-based plus analysis of all legislation. So yeah, they're basically the watchdog for all the other, they're the Ministry of Truth, right? It's so in Canada, it's coming in more that way than it is through the education system, but it is still there. Like, and our focus on the education system ever since, especially like Bill C-16, has been more on the gender side of things. So you'll have more of a push on, like their lawsuits. I'm sure just getting way off here, but the lawsuits, there's one in Ontario where a little girl was told that there's no such thing as 100% boy, 100% girl, and she was in kindergarten, and she was asked to just put on her spectrum where she was, and she put it at 100% girl, and the teacher said there's no such thing, that's impossible, you can't be a boy or a girl like that. And like, I mean, you're messing, like a kindergarten kid, right? So 5 or 6 years old, you're messing up these little kids. So yeah, we've got our issues.
Yeah, no, yeah, certainly. And I've been very aware of the post-colonial lens being up here. And in some ways, it's been good. My son has learned, I mean, he can talk about, so he knows so much about, First Nations and Indigenous cultures. And I think there's something really great and really powerful about that. I think that it's when you then take it and use that lens to see everything, through which to see everything and, impose, one kind of ideology onto everything else, which is, we're doing it with race in the US. We see everything through the lens of race. Nobody wants to talk about class, right? Everybody just wants to talk about race because that's, and again, like as a former professor of critical theory and critical race theory, I've taught all of these things in the classroom. I always taught it as, every school of thought within critical theory, and then including critical race theory, there are all of these different lenses that we can apply all of the time simultaneously. You don't just pick one and then everybody has to use that lens. It's absolutely ridiculous, and I don't think that's what critical theory is there for. An example, like I would have the class, they would all read the same novel, and then they would each pick a theoretical lens to look at, through which to look at the novel, and they would write an essay and they would do a presentation. So, let's say one student was like, okay, I'm going to use feminist theory to read this novel, and then he or she would give their presentation and about, the way that the book changes based on how you look at it. And then somebody else would do critical race theory, somebody else would do Marxism, somebody else would do deconstruction. And, the fascinating thing is that depending on the lens that was used on the same book, the presentation and the interpretation completely different. And that's where I think that there's value and usefulness in critical theory. But, I think that it's and admittedly, I always kind of loved it. It was like this fun intellectual game. I never really expected it to be, free flying through the streets out of the university, and that's what's happening. And it's a problem.
Okay, but I mean, all right, now, admittedly, I have not read a lot of critical theory. Like, I mean, I got out of academia in the mid '90s. Then I went into IT. Like, there was no reason for me to have read a lot of it. Like, it was just,
Right.
and I've got a poli sci degree. Also, but I mean, I touched on some of the postmodernism when I was in school. I touched on some of the postcolonialism. But I just went into critical race theory and intersectionality, and I read some gender and queer theory. Like, I was I was getting called a white supremacist for criticizing Islam, and I'm like, where the hell is this coming from? And that was my whole impetus to find out where is this coming from, and then I ended up going down this rabbit hole. So yeah, and because of that, like I said, I read Marcuse's paper. I read a couple of his things. I read some Gramsci, but I didn't go back and read books, and I just didn't have time, and it was too dense, and I'm like, I'm not an academic anymore. But okay, as an intellectual exercise and as a way to look at things, as yeah, I could appreciate some of that stuff, but like you said, like, okay, it was meant to stay as an enterprise, but it was, I don't know how much you know about like things like the Muslim Brotherhood or whatever. And the way I equated it was the guy who started the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna. He had an idea of an identity, a Muslim identity-based politics, basically. And he wanted a Muslim Brotherhood, and it would start, and I mean, he was getting followers, but it wasn't really accepted, and it was kind of kept to the fringes, and the government was opposed to it because there was someone else having power, right? Then you had Sayyid Qutb pick it up after Hassan al-Banna, and he did this thing called pan-Islamism. And I mean, he'd studied in the States in the late 40s or so. I'm going to get the dates wrong. And so he saw all this, like, he saw some of the Marxism, he saw some of this. I mean, like the Frankfurt School, I guess, was just getting going around that time. So he brings that back to North Africa, and he brings that back to Egypt, and he creates an Arab-based identity politics around it, and he makes it applicable, and it makes it more functional to be used outside. And I look at Derek Bell as Hassan al-Banna, and I look at Kimberly Crenshaw as Sayyid Qutb. Kimberly Crenshaw took the theoretical physics of critical race theory and made it into an applicable science like engineering, and that's when it got less loose on the world. And that's when you have everything looked at through that intersectional lens, or everything looked at through the lens of racism. And that's why you can get BLM saying free Palestine, because no one's free until we're all free, because it comes back to that interlocking thing of and I keep saying when Crenshaw wrote Mapping the Margins, she didn't map them, she gerrymandered them. Like, she just blended them all together. Sorry, that's my little spiel on critical theory.
No, it's fine. And listen, I think that what the idea of intersectionality in that legal context in which Crenshaw coined it, created it, I think there was meaning. And I think I mean, you can't deny that historically, in the US, there's been a really big disparity between a Black person who commits the same crime as a white person. Punishments and consequences and sentencings have not been the same, so she identified a legitimate problem. I think it just got taken so far outside of where it needed to be, or I don't even want to say where it was meant to be, because I don't really know the intentions.
No, I get that. And like, yeah, I'm not saying that. Okay, I thought her paper in '89, and I forget what it's called, because I'm getting it's like intersectional, but I think that was the one where she was talking about the car plant where they had only Black men in the back and only white women up front, but they had no Black women. And so they met their quota for, they met their racial quota, and they met their, gender quota, but there was no intersection of the two. Right. And then, like, the workers lost that case, or the person, but I mean, that's an interesting point. And but again, when you go outwards with that idea of intersectionality. Okay, so, and again, maybe that's not how she designed it to be used. And I know she said she's writing a book now coming out saying where she thinks it went wrong. Maybe I'll read it. I don't know. I'll give you an example of how some of this stuff, because like the intersectional feminist, when it mixes with gender theory, it harms women in India. And this is what like when we export it. So there's a really good interview, and this woman's also done a movie called Dysphoria or Dysphoric. She's an Indian woman. She's a filmmaker, and she was talking about how like the gender theory, and when you mix it with the intersectional feminism, well, you have to have feminism, blah blah blah. You have to look at where you're intersecting, who's more oppressed than not. So like the trans people are the most oppressed, and this. So when you're taking away that gendered language, and when you're taking away women's spaces, that is actually affecting women's safety, because they never even had a safe space for women as it is. Now you're allowing biological males into that space, and then these people are co-opting the idea of hijras in India, which was never a third sex. It was boys who got castrated for the most part, and then left on temple steps, or just left to fend for themselves. And they would, so they created their own third community, but it wasn't like we're accepting this third sex type of thing. So they're using that, and they're harming women. So she says it's another form of colonization. It's another form of colonialism. It's a Western idea being foisted onto women in India.
Interesting.
And so that's where where she was looking at the legal cases. Yeah, I'm not trying to deny that there was problems, but the solution to your problem is not the right one. Pointing it out is one thing, but what are you proposing as a solution? And that I think the approach is a good way to maybe look at it and find the issue, but it's not a good way to solve it. So, you need something else to solve it. So that, like I said, if you look at the effect this is having in other countries, again, if you look at Africa, if you look at North Africa, the whole post-colonial thing, it was real detriment to the Berbers and the Amazigh. I mean, their culture was completely wiped out, and it's, North Africa are Arab countries. No, they're not. The Arabs were colonizers. They came in, they wiped out a rich culture. Sudan and Somalia get called Arab countries. In what world are Sudan and Somalia Arab countries? They're Arab speaking because, again, colonization. South Africa, like I said, in 2016, they had the first conference. Last year, they announced at the University of Johannesburg or the University of Cape Town, a Department of Black Physics.
Wow.
So this stuff is another form of colonization. And I mean, I just recently spoke to a native guy from the US, and he's Hopi, and I guess he's part white, part native, and he lives on the Hopi reservation, and he was talking about the damage that's doing to native culture. And it's again, like, so they're well-meaning. Like, don't get me wrong, the people who are, maybe the people at the very top who are, like that woman who just left BLM, like maybe they're doing it to bilk or whatever, but the people on the ground, or people who are doing work, they're well-meaning. And again, like, I have no other term for it but evil, because you're taking people's good intentions and you're twisting it, and you're making something horrific come out of it. And it doesn't help, like, what's going on in native culture right now. Like, again, I'm speaking to one person, and I'm getting his story from it, but what he's seeing in his on his with his tribe and his reservation, what's going on with young people, he's like, they're wallowing in victimhood. They just want to be victims. And that's not going to help anyone get better. And like that, there's my problem with this stuff. I'm not saying that there's issues, but the way it's applied, and the way, and if she writes her book and maybe she means something different, I'm willing to give her a listen. But everything I've seen from her, it doesn't add up with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in many ways, what's also happening is that, you talk about the people who have good intentions. And I think, so many of these social justice warriors, they do have good intentions, and they want to make the world a better place. They hear about all the racism, and they want it to go away, and they want to do their part. And I get that, and I respect that. But I think there's a serious lack of knowledge and that's being exploited by the people at the tops of these movements. And I think that that's part of the problem. And, just going back to the K through 12 issue, kids are now being taught what to think instead of how to think. And that is a tremendous problem, to not be able to think critically, to not be exposed to ideological diversity. Just going back to my son's school in LA, they're one of the most diverse private schools. It might be the most diverse private school in Los Angeles in terms of faculty and students. And, everything's like diversity, diversity, diversity. And it's always been a great place, a wonderful place. And once they shifted gears after last summer and started changing everything, changing the website, bringing in anti-bias facilitators, it changed everything. And so, what became crystal clear is that ideological or viewpoint diversity is not the kind of diversity that they're looking for or that they will tolerate. And so I think I'm deeply saddened by that. I'm worried and I'm saddened because how do you learn how to think critically if you're not exposed to different viewpoints? I with some of the things that I've written in the past 6 months, I've lost 2 friends who just disagreed with some parts of what I said. It wasn't like they thought everything I said was horrible. They just disagreed with a couple parts, or, one very close friend told me that she agreed with everything I had written. This was in a Newsweek article. She agreed with everything I'd written. I didn't see anything wrong, but that because I'm not Black, I had no right to speak about it at all. She dropped me as a friend. Literally dropped me. And, it's this is what's happening. Nobody can tolerate ideological diversity anymore. We can't tolerate somebody having an opinion that's different from ours. I have, academic friends who do disagree with me, but we still, I'm thinking of a few people in particular, we still have conversations and we still respect each other. But I think that is a phenomenon that's fading very, very quickly. And I think that's tremendously sad.
That's okay. Again, I'll, bang on this drum, but the repressive tolerance. That's what that is. Whether it's coming from someone who's right wing or left wing. Oh, you believe in abortion, I have to cut you out. If you're a right wing person, I don't know, but let's take that for example. Oh, you supported Trump's moving the embassy to Jerusalem, I have to cut you out. Whatever. That's repressive tolerance. That's all it is. It's you repress in your mind. You think that, because more Black women get abortions, so you think, okay, if you stop abortions, it'll be more Black babies or whatever that you're thinking is there. That's evil. So someone who supports abortion, I have to cut them out. Or, someone who doesn't support Black Lives Matter must be racist and evil, so I have to cut them out. That's what that's been doing. And again, if you go back and look at it, it's from the mid 80s that stuff came in. And that was first to train the teachers, then it got into schools. If you look at the way painting conservatism and, on the Fox side and the Breitbart and, when Rush Limbaugh was still alive and he was anything liberal was evil. So I'm not saying that there isn't on the other side. Whatever, not that I'm not a huge fan or anything, but clean your room, like the Jordan Peterson thing. I've always said I was from the on the left side of things. So I want my side fixed because when the crazies came out in the 90s and the 80s for rock music and rap music and whatever, the Christian right, when they came out, there was a sensible left. Those people on the right never went away, but the sensible left is gone. It's I'm not saying critical race theory is the biggest problem that we're facing. I'm saying things like critical race theory and intersectionality, gender, they present the biggest impediment to solving our problems. Like when you have people saying, get rid, I'm not, whatever you think of Greta Thunberg, but now there's activists saying we want activists of color because there's enough white people. And I'm not going to get involved in the environment until we get activists of color. Okay. That's an impediment to getting environmental issues solved.
Right.
looking at everything as in white people evil and whiteness evil is not going to solve racial issues, you know, and calling everyone and everything a transphobe because they don't want, you know, biological men competing with women is so therein my lies my problem with all this stuff is if we could actually have that conversation, we could fix a lot of these problems. But this thing gets in there and it divides, and it only knows how to break apart. I mean, they took the disrupt and dismantle, and they, you know, they actually want to do that. They want to disrupt and dismantle everything, and it's, you know, it's not a mind, it's not a, you know, like a mental exercise anymore.
Right. Right. Well, and you can't criticize what's going on in your own backyard. And this gets into some of your personal history. You know, you can't criticize your own group. You know, I'm a liberal. I'm somebody who's left of center. And that's, you know, I've never been, I mean, well, maybe when I was like a freshman in college, I was maybe I was a conservative, but you know, don't tell. But you know, I mean, as you know, most of my adult life, you know, especially because I've been an academic, you know, I've been somebody who's on the left, but also somebody who's always willing to kind of like see if there's a good point on the other side. I'm always happy to acknowledge it because I appreciate that. That's just how my brain works. You know, but like some of the criticisms I've made about some of the stuff going on the left, you know, criticizing my own group has, you know, somebody on Twitter a couple of weeks ago referred to me as a known radical right-wing activist. I was like, no, but this is what's happening, right? You just want to like make your own side better, and you get accused of being on the other side, you know, the dark, evil other side. And this is such a problem. And like even thinking about, you know, all of these Black heterodox voices, so many of them are on the left, you know, people like you know, John McWhorter, for instance. But they're, you know, some of these people are increasingly going on talk shows like Megyn Kelly, right, who's a conservative talk show host, because people on the left don't want to have conversations with heterodox thinkers. And so it's forcing us into conversations with people on the right. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a good thing, because I think we're both, you know, those of us who lie just to the left or just to the right of the center are starting to realize that maybe we have more in common. Maybe there are conversations and dialogues that can be really useful here. So I think ultimately it's not a bad thing, but, you know, when somebody like, you know, John McWhorter goes on, you know, Megyn Kelly's show, he's going to get demonized by the left. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem. Like, we're really at an impasse. I mean, you just, I don't know where to go from here.
And okay. And the other way around, like, and I don't want to, because I haven't really seen it, but let's say, someone like Thomas Sowell went on the Young Turks. Okay, I don't think that would happen, you know, but let's just say that happened. You would get a bunch of Thomas Sowell fanboys going, "How could you go speak to Cenk Uygur and blah 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 blah?" Like, you would have that happen. Like, so yeah, no, I mean, it is, there is that, and I don't want to do a both sidesism here, but there is, again, it's the best way I've heard this explained, and it just maybe because it was easy for me to visualize it. You know, I'd been kind of cheesily using the Yeats poem there, The Second Coming, saying, you know, the center cannot hold, but it was James Lindsay, who was on Joe Rogan a couple of years back, and he described it. He said, if you look at a centrifuge, what a centrifuge does is it takes everything and it splits it out, pushes it to the edges, and then it breaks apart in the middle. So you could have like a ball of water in the middle, and you start spinning and spinning and spinning it, everything goes to the edges and nothing left in the center. That's what's been happening here. It's, you know, the Democrats start going a little further left. So instead of the Republicans moving just a little bit more to the center, not even to the left, but just closer to their side of the center, they go further right. And then the Democrats go further right. And then it's, you know, that pendulum is going from one extreme to the other, and it's not stopping in the same middle for any time, any, you know, valuable length of time. It needs to slow down in that center for a little bit. And that's, someone's got to take the first move and move back into the center. But it's like, you know, playing chicken. It's
right. Well, and I mean, and the irony is that most Americans, and I'm going to guess most Canadians, are more moderate, right? Most, I'll speak for Americans. Americans, for the most part, aren't extreme radical, those kinds of sensibilities don't define them. Those are small, loud groups. Most people are probably a little closer to the center and are more moderate and don't want radical politics. But that seems like, all we have right now, or we're very quickly getting to a point where that's all we have.
Yeah. And I mean, look, I don't want to keep you too much longer. We've been going for a bit, but yeah, like that radical politics. And again, I think I'll tie this back to how we started the anti-Semitism. That's kind of a canary in the coal mine for the radical politics, because, okay, like I said, I saw with the brown people, you're white adjacent, that's okay. I put that in my Twitter bio that that I'm adjacent, and I even called myself an enabler, because these stupid terms that make you mean you're supposedly evil, but you're white adjacent, but I mean, look how fast it took for attacks on Jewish people. And I mean, the whole idea of Jews with whiteness, I'm not saying it wasn't around for a while, but it just really got pushed in the last year. And it's, so when that starts happening, I'll leave you with, I'll give it to you after this, but I've always said I'm afraid of the overcorrection that's coming on the left, but I'm terrified of the overcorrection that will come from the right. And that's where I'm at right now. I mean, I don't want to see a race war. There was just recently an article, and I'm trying to figure, it was in a large paper. More and more whites are starting to become aware of their racial identity. And, we should get away from everyone getting their racial identity, but we don't need a white racial identity politics. We've seen where that leads.
Right. And this is the logical and the end result of pushing critical race theory as the only way to see everything. This is a problem. I mean, it's forcing people into these racial categories and to see themselves as, you have to pick. Am I white? Am I black? Am I brown? What am I? You have to pick. And that doesn't lead to a good place for anybody.
No, not at all. And again, like I said, I don't want to keep you too long. So thanks a lot for coming on. If you want to let people know where they can get a hold of you, if you got any last words, please go ahead.
I would say, check out the Speech Project page that I edit at the Jewish Journal. I'm trying to bring together a lot of heterodox voices and, pieces from different publications. And otherwise, you can find me on Twitter at Dr. Monica Osborne.
All right, great. Well, once again, thanks a lot, Monica. It was wonderful talking to you. And thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.